All right, good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for coming to Montgomery for All's April meeting, where we will be talking with some awesome, exciting legislators on the state level about what our issues look like in state policy making. But before we get into that, I wanted to provide a little introduction and updates. So Montgomery for All, if you've never come to a Montgomery for All meeting before, Montgomery for All is the grassroots organization of the Coalition for Smarter Growth. So Montgomery for All is a membership-based organization. We started in 2020, came together first around Thrive 2050, the county's new general plan that will guide and act as a blueprint for growth over the next 30 years. So we came together to create a platform for what we wanted to see in that plan in early 2020. And we all know how that went. 2020 happened, but we are still going strong. Oh, we have one of our other speakers here. So let me make sure that I make Delegate Solomon a co-host. There we go. And so we've been having these monthly meetings for the past 2 years, essentially. And a lot of them have been virtual, but we've been doing a lot of fun in-person events over the more recent times. So last month, it was great to see a lot of you in person at World of Beer in Rockville. Next month on May 21st, a Saturday, we will be doing a picnic, TBD on locations. If you have any recommendations for parks that you would like for us to have a picnic in, let me know. But we have been having a lot of amazing speakers come and talk to us. And we've also been continuing to do a lot of advocacy around Thrive 2050 and pushing for our priorities to be in the plan and to be prioritized in the plan. So an update on Thrive 2050 is that, let's see, if our last meeting where I gave updates in a virtual format was in February, then that was right after the Office of Legislative Oversight issued a memo about racial equity and social justice in Thrive. And that memo, among other things, found that Thrive should do more outreach to especially communities of color and low-income communities. So it was recommended to the council to essentially hire a consultant who would do that additional outreach and write a chapter on racial equity and social justice. So I'm not sure. I know that the RFP went out, the request for proposals from professional consultants who have experience in racial equity and social justice, as well as in land use planning. But I'm not sure if anyone has been selected yet. So that is a process that is ongoing. That consultant is supposed to finish up their work by July 1st. We'll see what happens there, though. I imagine that the county council will probably begin work sessions in September is my guess, and will finish up their work before the general election in November. So that's where things are at right now. We are about to launch a new educational series on Thrive. Since this is such a long-term campaign, we need to keep up the energy from you all, as well as help to educate more people about what Thrive is, what's in it. There's been a lot of confusion and misinformation about what is or isn't in Thrive and what it says or doesn't say. And so we've put together some resources before, including our Thrive fact sheet, which you can find on the Montgomery for All website. But over the course of the next few months, we'll be having an email series, different events, and webinars. You'll be the first to hear it right now here that we will be having a No New Highways webinar on May 16th. And that will feature some really awesome speakers, including Josh Tolkien from the Maryland Sierra Club, Margaret Shope, a local anti-highway activist, and Dr. Sakobi Wilson from the University of Maryland. And I'm really excited about that event. And hopefully there will be much more to come and more to announce in our All About Thrive series. So we'll certainly need your help to get the word out and continue to spread the word and stay excited about Thrive until we get it across the finish line. And with that, I will introduce our guest speakers and panel for tonight. So tonight we are talking about Annapolis and state policy making. We are a local group that is primarily focused on local issues. So there's a lot of knowledge that already exists, but this is certainly not our our wheelhouse necessarily. So I'm excited to learn about what happened because I'm not able to be as involved in Annapolis as I would like to be. And I'm sure we will all learn a lot. So first tonight we have with us Delegate Marc Korman, who represents District 16 and has been a member of the House of Delegates since 2015. He is a member of the Appropriations Committee, chair of the Transportation and Environment Subcommittee of the Appropriations Committee, and co-chair of the Transit Caucus. So thank you for being here, Delegate Korman. He is also, disclosure, my former boss from my internship all the way back in 2018. The old days I can't believe are now so long ago. We also have with us Delegate Jared Solomon, who represents District 18, and he has been a member of the House of Delegates since 2019, is also a member of the Appropriations Committee, vice chair of Education and Economic Development Subcommittee of the Appropriations Committee, and a member of the Transit Caucus. And then last but not least, we have Delegate Vaugh Stewart, who represents District 19 and has been a member of the House since 2019, sits on the Environment and Transportation Committee, and is also a member of the Transit Caucus. So we have 3 Transit Caucus members here tonight. That's certainly not a coincidence. And thanks to each of you for taking the time out of your post-session recovery to be with us here. For those who don't know, and I think most of you do, Annapolis, the Maryland General Assembly, which is in Annapolis, has a whirlwind 90-day session that is a relic of when pretty much anyone who was in the General Assembly was a land-owning farmer. Things have changed quite a bit since then, but we still have kept the 90-day session that runs January through early April. And I am going to start off with a pretty big question here, and there will be lots of opportunity for the audience to ask questions. So please feel free to put your questions in the chat now, put them as you think of them. But I'm going to kick us off with a pretty big question, and feel free to take this question in the direction that you would like to. But what happened at the Maryland General Assembly this year that relates to housing, land use, or transit? Those are the issues that we cover, but those issues are big and include a lot. And I would love to hear from each of you at least one thing related to that people should know about that happened in this most recent legislative session. Delegate Korman, I will kick it to you first.
Great. Well, thank you, Jane, for having us. I feel like I'm talking to like a live version of Twitter with all the names I see here. So this is exciting. I guess I should ask Mike, are you live tweeting this as we go? No? Okay. All right. Obviously, that's an open-ended question. I'm going to take it in the direction I feel like taking it, like an Uber driver instead of a light rail driver. I just give the optimist case for where we are in transit policy in Maryland. If you look at the past few years, there's been a real uptick of interest and change in the General Assembly. I mean, you mentioned the Transit Caucus that I'm not the co-chair of anymore. I'm now some other unnamed officer, but that's only 3.5 years old. And we have huge membership now, bipartisan actually, and have been able to move a lot of bills, including over the past few years, bills on the Southern Maryland Rapid Transit System, bills on Western Maryland commuter rail extension, obviously Delegate Solomon's MTA bill that I know he'll talk about with the Marc rail system. We passed the Maryland Transit Administration Investment Act a couple of years ago and overrode the veto last year or so. So a lot of really great successes. And I actually feel like, to get to your next issue that I'll really leave to Vaugh, housing is sort of next, right? When I got to the Maryland General Assembly a million years ago in 2015, transit wasn't actually talked about that much, but a lot of us came in, Delegate Learman and others at the same time, and it really led to a lot of interest and focus on that. Well, I feel like that's what's happening now with housing with folks like Delegate Stewart. So I think we're in for a sea change. I'll just say one sort of unsung success this year on transit was a really nice investment in bus rapid transit, mostly from Montgomery County, some one-time capital dollars, over $60 million to help the county build out their BRT system, and then a continuous funding source coming out of lottery funds that'll continue into the future on an annual basis for Montgomery County and other counties if they deploy actual BRT that meets our definition of BRT, dedicated lanes, off-board fare collection, things like that. So a lot to be proud of. Obviously, we can do the pessimist case later, but that's the optimist case for transit in the General Assembly this year and really the last few years.
And can you tell us a little bit more about the $60 million in BRT and about some of the details of that legislation? Because that is something I know a lot of us are very interested in and would be super excited about.
Sure. So the $60 million was just part of our capital budget. That was just something Montgomery County focused a lot on, putting as much capital money as possible. So that's a one-time, one-year investment that the county, there's a small amount of it that's specifically held for 29, but the county can actually spend it on any of the BRT lines that they're interested in building out. And I think their focus next is going to be 355 North. That's great. We should be proud of that. And we should try again next year to get more capital money. But I think the thing that's going to be the real difference maker is this $27 million a year. I'm sure this was very controversial to many of you, but there was a lot of stadium politics that went on this year around Canham Yards and M&T Bank and FedEx Field. We can discuss the details of the stadiums if you're interested, but the upshot for Montgomery County is our ask in all of that was to make sure that if we're going to take money out of the lottery for stadiums in Baltimore and redevelopment in Prince George's County, we want money for bus rapid transit because that's our economic development vision in Montgomery County. And so we were able to get that. So once the Stadium Authority begins drawing lottery revenues for the work they want to do on M&T Bank and Canham Yards, go O's with a tough loss today, the money will start flowing to Montgomery County for BRT on a continuous basis. So we don't have to fight for that every year. That money just flows automatically.
Great. Well, I'm certainly excited to hear that, especially because one of the big wins in the Montgomery County capital budget this year has been getting actual construction funding for Veers Mill BRT in the 355 Central route. But some of that money is predicated on the 495-270 highway expansion, which Coalition for Smarter Growth is not a fan of, and most of the folks on this call are also not fans of. And so having another source of money that does not include a major highway expansion is extremely exciting.
I mean, I'll just say those of us in the legislature who share your skepticism of the project aren't sitting around waiting for magic money. We made the tough choices of how to use tax dollars and how to use, lottery revenue to fund the things we want to see funded and not wait for a magic source of money that may never come.
Definitely. I'll pass it next to Delegate Vaugh Stewart.
Thank you very much, Jane. I appreciate it. I apologize for a bit of a nasal vernacular I have this evening. I am actually recovering from COVID myself. So my symptoms were overall pretty mild. I'm good. Stay safe out there. We are undergoing a little bit of a wave here, sort of this second Omicron variant. So I've been fortunate and vaccinated and I'm all good. Really, you are the main victims of my diagnosis because you're going to have to deal with my voice this evening. But it's awesome to be with everyone tonight. I really appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to chat about these important issues. It's also great, of course, to be with two of my favorite members of the House of Delegates, two members who are obviously much smarter than me and also slightly nerdier than me, which makes me feel nice. So in his really good book that probably many of y'all have read, The Affordable City, Shane Phillips, he kind of lays out three co-equal priorities when it comes to land use and housing. And I really like this framing, and I'm going to steal it for tonight. And so he talks about the three S's: supply, stability, and subsidy. And supply is, of course, about having enough homes for everyone. And so when housing is hard to come by, all the other obstacles to affordability become that much more difficult to overcome. So, obviously, as you all know, rents and home prices go up, the cost of construction balloons, landlords gain more leverage over renters, and poorer renters are displaced by members of higher earning households, with the less fortunate pushed out, to areas with fewer amenities and with, worse access to jobs. Stability is basically about recognizing the dignity of housing, and then it's more than just an investment vehicle, but it's really a home. And so stability relates to mostly, tenant protections and rental housing preservation. And subsidy is about ensuring that everyone benefits from abundant housing and stable communities. And so while, I think a private housing market can serve the needs of some, but not all of the population, we do need greater public involvement if we're going to make good on our professed belief that housing is a human right. And so subsidy generally refers to, rental assistance or publicly subsidized housing construction and acquisition. So using that framing, my thesis on the Maryland General Assembly has basically been that we have been good on stability, pretty bad on subsidy, and completely absent on supply. And so I'm pleased to report, I'll start with, I guess, the optimist take here. I'm pleased to report that in the last 2 legislative sessions, the General Assembly's posture towards stability has gone from muted at best to downright aggressive. And this is sort of what Delegate Korman alluded to, which is that on some of these tenant protection issues, we have really kind of had a sea change in Annapolis in the last few years, since maybe my class and Jared's class came in. And so this session, we completed some unfinished business from last session by funding the Access to Counsel program. This is a first in the nation program that promotes housing stability by providing tenants with free lawyers to help defend themselves from eviction to remain in their homes. And that's great. And we funded it in a couple of different ways. Less importantly, after 3 years of trying, and with the help of my Senate sponsor, Jeff Waldstreicher of District 18, we also finally got the Senate to pass the Tenant Protection Act, which had passed the House in previous years, which is HB 86 and SB 6. This is a kind of an omnibus renter protection bill. Each individual element is honestly not that big of a deal, but together I think represents a pretty solid step forward. So it does a bunch of stuff, but it, for example, allows tenants to access meeting rooms free of charge for the purpose of tenant organizing. It makes it easier for survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault to break their leases early to escape dangerous situations. And it requires landlords to provide receipts and invoices when they withhold security deposits. So overall, a pretty good step forward, a lot of common sense items. It received bipartisan support. We even got some landlords to go along with it by the end once they saw the writing on the wall. And then, as I mentioned, our record, I'll get to supply like later in the evening, but on subsidy, our record has been mostly bad. We did provide more funding using the budget surplus for some state affordable housing programs, but our investment in housing construction still pales in comparison to a lot of our peers. Since 1992, since I was 4 years old, our housing trust fund at the state level has spent about 50 million, 50, on the construction of affordable housing. That's a number that a lot of our peer states spend in like 3 or 4 months. And we've spent it in 30 years. So we have a lot of way to go on the issue of investment and subsidy. I will say that we did 2 interesting things. One is that we made the federal rental assistance program better by passing a few bills. So one of them I did with Senator Hettleman, which was SB 384, that pauses eviction proceedings if there's been a good faith application for rental assistance. This is both just common sense because I think it's just immoral to kick people out of their homes when we're sitting on hundreds of millions of dollars in federal dollars. But it also makes the program work better by incentivizing landlords to apply earlier in the process for rental assistance if they think that there might be a pause if they don't because of the threat of the tenant applying. There's also a bill that I worked on with Senator Susan Lee from Delegate Korman's district, District 16, which was HB 932 and SB 592 that passed. It basically says that it closes a loophole by basically saying that rental assistance checks from a government entity are an acceptable form of payment for tenants to provide landlords. This basically closes the loophole we were seeing, especially in Montgomery County, where landlords were denying tenants their ability to pay and stay at the end of a lease term because they were claiming that on the state's list of acceptable forms of payment, like direct deposit or physical checks or whatever, that a check from a government wasn't listed, which I think they were on not so firm legal footing on, but we went ahead and closed that loophole and made good on that. And then lastly, I would just point to a bill that Senator Hettleman and Delegate Flackovich-Carr of District 17 worked on, which is HB 927 and SB 744, which passed both chambers and I think is waiting for the governor's decision, but it essentially makes it easier to dispose of excess real property that the state owns and makes it easier for it to become or used or developed into affordable housing based on certain factors. So that's sort of exciting because as many of you know, I've tried for a long time to increase the state's investment in social housing and the construction of public housing. We still have not been able to do that and to support the innovative efforts that the county, that the HOC on the county level has done with the Housing Production Fund. And I can get into more of that later, but I do think that Delegate Plokovich-Carr and Senator Heddleman's bill represents a bit of a step forward on the issue of subsidy and on the issue of the construction of affordable housing. So yeah, with that is sort of, I guess, the optimist take on housing and land use, but we obviously have a long way to go, which I'll get into later.
Well, we all need the positivity. So thank you for these optimistic outlooks here. And next up, Delegate Solomon, if you could tell us about some of the exciting things that happened this session that haven't quite been covered yet. I know that there's certainly something exciting that happened with Marc.
Indeed. Yeah. Thank you, Jane. It's really great to be here. And I like how Vaughn says the rest of us are smarter than him, and then opens up with some brilliant quote from an esoteric, tome on affordable housing. So we'll just leave that there. But it's really great to be with you all. And it's really great to be with Vaughn and Marc, certainly two of my favorites. And I think Marc really undersold himself as usual. Marc was just brilliant this year in really not only kind of rallying items in the capital budget and sort of long-term vision on the bus rapid transit piece, but the capital budget and the investments that we got in the operating budget are, really transformative. It's frankly a lot easier, obviously, to spend surplus money than it is to figure out where to cut. But what I think we were able to get in the budget this year with Marc's leadership, not only on appropriations, but as our delegation chair. So Marc is sort of our leader of the 24 of us in the House. Kind of help speak for Montgomery County's priorities to House leadership. We got just a tremendous amount of wins. So he mentioned the bus rapid transit piece. We got $12 million for the Bethesda Metro South entrance. That I'm sure many folks know, is obviously fairly over budget for the Purple Line, but really important to making sure that piece of it is fully integrated and completed. We got money to underground the parking lots in Bethesda as part of the women's farm market at the very edge of my district. Turn those into parks and then underground the parking lots, which will just be great for the integration of green space and that part of Bethesda. We got money for zero emission buses. We got $10 million in the operating budget for infrastructure upgrades to begin development at White Flint. We got a pre-authorization of, I think, $6 or $7 million for improvements to the White Flint Metro further down the line. I think the hope is that this money will sort of seed a lot of the infrastructure improvements that will be necessary for, another life science or, university development. We've been in talks with the county and the university system to sort of locate some, tie-in to a lot of the AI and quantum work that's going on at College Park with the life science work that's going on at Shady Grove. And so being able to get the infrastructure ready for future building and a future development will just I think really be life-changing for that section of the county, as opposed to the giant parking lot and empty Lord and Taylor that sits there now. Just item after item in the capital budget, from big things to small things, were just huge wins for the county. And that was, again, just collective work on many folks' part, and again and a great deal to Delegate Korman's leadership as our delegation chair. And then, so the bill that I'm really excited about, and again, I think this is representative of really the coalition that we've built through the Transit Caucus and a lot of the new voices that have come in since 2018, and building on the great work from Delegate Korman's class in 2014. So we passed a bill this year, the Maryland Regional Rail Transformation Act, that builds on a bill that we passed in 2020, which was sort of the nose under the camel's tent, the camel's nose under the tent of beginning to work on significant improvements to the MARC rail system. So in 2020, the bill that we passed was sort of the start conversation around eventually getting us to run through service to connect, the small commuter gap that we have in northern Maryland, connecting into Delaware from about Elkton up to Newark, and then beginning to run trains through the District of Columbia and into Alexandria and Virginia for both MARC going south, obviously, and then VRE going north. And so that bill in 2020 was the last bill we passed before we adjourned early. The governor vetoed it. We overrode it in 2021. And it was to sort of get the conversation rolling, get MTA to start working on agreements with other state governments, start looking at what some of the technical issues might be, and maybe even do a pilot program if the space was there. So MTA came back to us with a report at the end of this year. Unsurprisingly, they didn't make a ton of progress. I mean, they actually have made some progress with Virginia and kind of hammering out, memorandum of understanding that'll begin a lot of the more technical work, but they didn't really get a whole lot done. And we sort of, started thinking, especially as the federal infrastructure bill was starting to get, more and more real, that we have, frankly, a regional rail system in the state that is, incredibly underutilized and incredibly underinvested in. Many of the stations that we have across the state are literally parking lots or fields and a platform. And for most folks, they cannot use Marc reliably because it is meant to be, getting you into the population center, whether it's Baltimore or DC in the morning, and then getting you back out in the evening. It doesn't run on the weekends. It doesn't really, it doesn't run frequently enough. God forbid you have to work late and you miss your train, you're pretty much stuck. And I think it's even more important to reimagine Marc because obviously those commuter patterns don't really hold anymore. People are going in maybe 1 or 2 days a week and they're going in at odd hours, or, they really don't want to drive. They want to go out to Frederick on the weekends. And when we think about, not only access to jobs, but access to affordable housing, and how that dovetails with 270 and the push to widen. We think about all of the affordable housing that an additional additional service on the Marc system could open up in areas like Frederick and northwestern Montgomery County, or places like Howard and Baltimore County, if folks had reliable means of transportation. And so this bill was really an opportunity for us to say, look, we've had these grand plans. Jim Gilchrist, who's retiring, was cleaning out his office a couple of weeks before the end of session, and he pops into my office and he gives me this document that's got a schematic of sort of what we would like the Marc system to be, and it's got the connections to Delaware, it's got the connections to Virginia, and he starts laughing and he's like, look, they're doing everything that you've asked them to, and kind of look at him with a quizzical expression, and he says, turn to the cover sheet, and it's from 2006. And it's a document, it's almost 20 years old, and so a lot of these plans have been in the works or at very high levels for 2 or 3 decades, and nothing has ever happened with them. And so what our bill requires is actual certain immediate investments to get us to 15 or 30% design on a few items, including a new station in Elkton for that run-through service into Delaware, a new station in Bayview in East Baltimore, where the Bayview Hospital Complex is, upgrades, 30% design upgrades for the Germantown station in Montgomery County, 30% design for the 4th track on the Brunswick line, and a few other, the Penn line, which is a little bit further along, so that we actually have truly transformational infrastructure items that we could turn around and apply for, what is potentially the upwards of $60 to $65 billion of federal funding that's available to really transform the Marc rail system. But then even more than that, we're asking for essentially investment plans in all of the different rail lines that we've got, so that we know for the next 5 years at a time what it's actually going to take to realize the vision that we see in these high-level documents, as Delegate Korman is saying, the cornerstone plan or these growth and investment plans that never sort of get any more granular than just a big vision. And so these investment plans would sort of be step by step. What do we as the General Assembly or future governor have to put in a capital budget? What do we actually have to, next year we've got to put new signals in. Maybe the year after we've got to put a siding to make sure that we can get around a freight train, or we've got to buy more rolling stock. And then getting us granular detail of what ridership estimates would look like, what modeling would be, so that we can actually start building these things out instead of just talking about them. We think we would have liked to see a little bit more expansion on the Brunswick line. It's obviously a top priority for us in Montgomery County. We wound up taking that out of the bill because it wound up just being incredibly expensive. MTA is the least far along on sort of the expansion of a third track on the Brunswick line of any of the systems, but I think the total cost of this bill is somewhere still between $14 and $15 million. So this is a huge investment, probably the first in decades, that is looking at expanding the Marc rail as opposed to just sort of getting us back to a state of good repair. So really exciting. And as Delegate Korman mentioned, the bill was bipartisan. My colleagues from Western Maryland and from Cecil and Harford County were probably in some ways more excited about this bill than we were. And then we had this as part of the presentment package to get to the governor before session ended. He chose to veto it. Surprise, surprise. We overrode his veto, and I think one of my finest moments beyond Delegate Korman's great defense of the bill on the floor was the minority leader, Delegate Buckle, voted to override the governor's veto. So that should really tell you everything you need to know about, what kind of support we have in the General Assembly for this kind of work.
Very exciting there. Thank you very much, Delegate Solomon. Very exciting to hear about everything that happened this session and everything that is getting done. I know that I've been frustrated with the amount of great plans that exist, but the lack of implementation. So that is something that is particularly important to me, at least. Next question, and this will be my last question, and then we'll turn it over to the audience questions, is to now, I guess, look on not the negative side, but what needs to happen next. What are you going to be looking at in the 2023 session and on? What is not just, what is up this next session that you want to work on, but what is the world of possibility? How can we push even further than what people have previously thought was possible with land use, housing, and transit legislation at the state level? As Delegate Korman mentioned at the beginning, there has been a lot of energy around transit, especially over the past few years, which has been great. And I know that especially this audience is interested in the connection with land use and housing as well. So what are, thinking about the really big picture, how do we get there, and what role does state policy making play in that? Let's see, I'll go back. Let's see, maybe I'll snake it this time and give Delegate Solomon the chance to answer first.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's so obviously first and foremost, we'll have to make sure that we're implementing all of the great legislation and policies that we've talked about. Obviously on the exciting front, but also on the, somewhat trepidatious front. Hopefully we'll have a new governor who will be much more amenable to this kind of stuff. And so rather than us having to fight the governor tooth and nail, and then frankly, having to make sure that we're holding, the agencies accountable to actually implement the legislation that we've sort of forced on them, that will have folks in every level of government and every agency in the state government to say, how are we working hand in glove to get this through? On the transportation front, I think it is going to be making sure that MDOT and MTA are really looking at the federal infrastructure dollars as a way to make, a lot of these great things that we're talking about possible. Again, that was what was so important about the bill that I mentioned earlier, is making sure that, because if we didn't do it this year, and it took us another year or two to get even just sort of this initial bill through, there wouldn't necessarily be the plans ready, to take advantage of the 4 to 5 year timeline that the federal infrastructure bill is going to present. So on that piece, I think, that's where we've got to put our focus. I know Delegate Korman will probably talk a little bit about sort of, a rail authority that looks at more sustainable long-term funding, similar to the mechanism that we talked about for bus rapid transit. We don't want this to just be one-time dollars. We want there to be a sustainable source of long-term funding that we can bond against and that we can use to fund. The other thing that I would mention, we haven't really talked about tonight, and I think it was kind of a mixed bag, is pedestrian safety legislation. And again, I think, all of you here tonight, all of us, certainly in Montgomery County, I think have done a really good job of lifting it up with the gubernatorial candidates. It seems like a very minor issue, but it's something that every candidate I've talked to, I've said, make sure you have a plan, because this is incredibly important, frankly, in every corner of our county and every corner of the state. I had a small bill that took 3 years to get through around getting, something as basic as a pedestrian safety plan that collaborates with the community on when you build a new school or when you rebuild a school. And it took us 3 years to get that through. Delegate Charkoudian had a great bill that would mandate additional funding levels and sort of change the process that MTA uses to fund pedestrian improvement items. That unfortunately didn't get out of the Senate, but Delegate Korman was a huge reason it got out of the House. Delegate Polakovich-Carr and Senator Waldstreicher had a Vision Zero bill that did pass that sort of changes the way and requires MDOT to and SHA to basically put together a plan when there's a fatality. Doesn't require them to actually then implement it nor fund it, but at least putting the plan together and having to focus on it is a good start. So I think we still have a lot of work to do on road design and pedestrian safety and allocating money to get those things in place. And I know it's going to be a top focus of all of us going forward. Again, hopefully with a governor that's way more interested and amenable to this kind of stuff.
Thank you. Delegate Stewart.
Sure. Thank you. So we got a lot to do on housing, and we've sadly we're being, as I think some people in the chat alluded to, we're really being outpaced on I think subsidy, supply, and stability by a lot of neighboring states. And so, first I'll just say, as I alluded to earlier on the issue of subsidy, we can do a lot more. So I'd like to see, for example, the state supplement federal efforts. I'd like to see a direct funding mechanism for a state level housing voucher program, because we know we have really long wait lists for access to federal vouchers. And I think that's something that the state could do. I would also like to see, as I alluded to, much more money, the state dollars pouring into the construction of housing, both nonprofit and public housing. As y'all might know, and I see we have Zachary Marks from HOC here tonight, actually, but MoCo's Housing Opportunities Commission is really the national leader on constructing mixed income public housing. It's really kind of the model that a lot of other jurisdictions across the country are looking to. And I think that it's kind of a damn shame, a real shame, that the state has not done more to help HOC and similar counterpart organizations across the state help them serve their mission, because they're doing really a hell of a job. But I'm hopeful that in future sessions, especially if we can continue having a bit of a budget surplus or money left over, or with a new governor with a different set of priorities, that we can just pour more money into the subsidy element of this. And then, I think that there's still more to do on stability. So I'm not an advocate for hardcore rent control. I think it's, has failed in, any jurisdiction that's been tried. But I do think that there's something to be said for a more flexible sort of anti-gouging law that's, CPI plus 6 or 7%. And I think that could be something that we could look into in Maryland in the future. And I think it's interesting that a state like Oregon actually paired a bill to cap rent increases with its duplex, triplex, quadplex bill in the same package. And they were able to create a broader coalition for both bills by pursuing that legislative strategy. So I think that's an interesting note. And then that leads me into the discussion of supply, which I neglected to mention earlier because there's really nothing good to say about it. And I know there's some questions in the chat that I'll go ahead and just try to address now, so you don't have to come back to me on that. But supply is really the housing priority that the General Assembly has most retreated from. Even as our counterpart state legislatures have increasingly pursued innovative reforms like legalizing duplexes. Maryland has long taken the position that land use and zoning reforms are the sole province of counties and municipalities. And this posture can be seen in the swift defeat of a bill like HB 1259, SB 871 from Delegate Belcastro and Senator Washington. And that bill would have legalized ADUs statewide, but it received a really rough hearing in my committee and never really was given much serious consideration. And as people in the chat alluded to, for local level land use decisions, like when MoCo legalized ADUs, you hear a lot of concerns from wealthy homeowners of single family homes, right? You hear NIMBY concerns about neighborhood aesthetics or shadows or whatever, air quality, bogus stuff that we're all used to hearing, right? But we really don't hear much of that in Annapolis. Like, I don't, maybe the NIMBYs don't realize where Annapolis is, like they haven't found us yet or whatever. But, instead, what's substituted is a lot of concern about local control. And I think part of the reason for this is that in many parts of the state, service in local government is a stepping stone to serving in the state legislature. And so, we hear the idea that seemingly local and city governments, it's like their divine right to have like the sole authority over land use and zoning. That's kind of the Annapolis consensus. And so, I think one thing to realize is that in states like, California, Massachusetts, Oregon, et cetera, they've been having conversations about preempting or at least overseeing localities on these issues. They have a tradition of doing this, in some cases dating back to the 70s, is when Oregon and California, I know, started passing bills in this regard. And so in this way, Maryland is kind of like 40 or 50 years behind. And so there's a question in the chat about like, how do we overcome this? How can folks that are listening tonight, like what can we do to sort of overcome this, local control objection in particular? And so I think that, first of all, y'all should keep doing what you're doing, which is just organize, continue building up existing institutions, like MoCo YIMBY, like this organization, like Greater Washington, that, pro-housing, established institutions, keep talking to your neighbors, keep organizing. But this year in particular, we have a once in a 4-year opportunity to elect new people. And so, I know zoning and housing and Thrive and all that is going to be a really hot topic for county council candidates and county candidates generally. But please also press candidates for the state legislature on what they believe on housing. Like, don't let them get away with just saying that, oh, like I support affordable housing or I like renters. Like, really press them that they understand how supply and stability and subsidy are all interconnected. Like, do they seem like they have a deeper level interest in this, or are they just sort of parroting talking points? Do they have a superficial understanding, or worse yet, do they sort of harbor kind of NIMBY tendencies? Like, definitely like elect good people. And I know there'll probably be some questionnaires floating around and scorecards floating around, but pay attention to that, because we're going to have a whole new state legislature next year. There are a lot of vacancies, not necessarily in MoCo, but there will be a lot of new blood coming in. And as Delegate Korman and Delegate Solomon alluded to, sometimes these kind of waves of freshmen really have a way of recentering the General Assembly's priorities. And so that's really kind of the big opportunity that we all have. But then beyond that, I think, the strategy here for overcoming local control, I think, to use Delegate Solomon's analogy here, is we need to find kind of our own camel's nose under the tent. I think we need to really work, maybe even over this interim. I'm happy to talk with you all about this, but we need a bill with broad support among multiple groups from across the state, multiple different organizations, that would really establish a precedent for preemption. Not necessarily ADUs everywhere or duplexes everywhere or quadplexes everywhere or upzoning everywhere, but something that is sort of a no-brainer, that we could just establish for the first time some sort of precedent for the state intervening in this area, so that we don't just continually hit our heads against the wall with this talking point of, oh, the state doesn't do this, the state doesn't do this. But I'll just conclude by just saying, on supply, if we can overcome this hurdle, the possibilities are obviously endless. We could take on pernicious parking minimums. We could use a stick approach by limiting state subsidies for localities that block housing. We could use a carrot approach by increasing funding for pro-housing jurisdictions. We could try to legalize by right construction of housing in certain places, like on the property of churches and hospitals. But first, we have to overcome this prevailing Annapolis consensus that deities themselves, decided that counties and cities are the, inviolable spheres of zoning policy discussion. So, yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Delegate Korman?
So before I answer the question, it wasn't deities decided, it was politics, and that was in the original question. How do we overcome the politics? And I think a lot of you know this, but I would just encourage you to go back and look at. There have been 2 efforts in the last 25 years to bring up a more statewide perspective to land use and planning. Now, they did not do exactly what Mike's Twitter feed would encourage people to do, but they were pretty significant efforts. Plan Maryland, which sparked a pretty big political backlash known as the War on Rural Maryland, and Governor Glendenning's really invention of smart growth. So I would just encourage you to look at the politics around those things, because frankly, they were political losses. I don't say they were political losers. I don't think they're political losers. I think they're good issues that they're important to pursue, but something was not done correctly in the way those were promoted and implemented and developed to get the necessary political buy-in, which we need for sustainable, sustainable policy. If there's a political backlash that pushes people back the other way, you've had a nice short-term victory, but that's not, that's not sustainable. We want things that are sustainable. So I would just give you my old man history lesson there for a brief second. And then I'll shift back to transportation, because that's really my bailiwick. I think the 2 things, one is the revenue piece, how we're going to pay for all this stuff. We actually tucked into Delegate Solomon's really well-named Mark Rail bill, a work group on transportation revenue funding. And we also snuck in the highway user revenue bill some increased corporate income tax going to the Transportation Trust Fund, which we can use for things beyond highway user revenue. But there's obviously a lot more to do there. We, it's a declining resource anyway, but the needs are only growing on the things we want to spend the money on. And the other thing, which is a little bit more cultural, is we just need to break the back of this concept in the General Assembly that Jared, Vaughn, and I should have more to say about what days of the week you can hunt in Hartford, or where you can drink a beer in Dorchester than we can about major transportation priorities of the state of Maryland. I mean, it just makes no sense, but that's what I hear again and again on the House floor, is that there's a process and the executive branch gets to decide. And even on things that are sort of broad policy direction, you know, I'm not saying I should get to pick and choose every project and how it gets funded, although, hey, maybe that's not the worst idea. But even on this idea that, hey, we might want to move a little bit more resources under Delegate Charkoudian's bill to ADA accessibility, and not pick and choose the projects, or not tell, MDOT where they have to take that money from, but just say this is a priority. I mean, you would think we were, violating one of the 10 commandments or something. And so breaking the back of that concept, to me, is really important, because the legislative branch is, one, it's a co-equal branch of government, but two, although the governor is elected statewide, that doesn't mean that the governor appreciates every corner of the state. And I say that it's whoever the governor is. We've had lots of Democratic governors who, don't know where 270 is, or where the purple line is supposed to connect. So that's not just a partisan thing. So it's important that we get, voices from around the state, and the legislative process is how we do that.
And to follow up on that, do you see that dynamic changing with the changes in the budget process that are happening?
Maybe, we'll see. There's some ideas there to try to give legislators a little bit more interest now that we'll have this new budgetary authority. I think you probably all know this, but until next year, we're the only legislative branch, at least the state level in the country, that can't move money around or add money to programs. We can only cut, but that's going to change starting in January, thanks to a constitutional amendment I suspect most of you voted for.
Yeah, that was I was talking with one of our steering committee members about how Maryland has such a uniquely strong governor, and that can really make things difficult sometimes, especially when transit is not necessarily a priority of that governor. Now I will turn it over to the audience questions. I think the first question I saw in the chat was from Darren. If you would like to ask your question. I think Delegate Korman responded to it a little bit in the chat, but if you wanted to get a more in-depth answer.
Yes, so thanks everybody. My name is Darren Fenwick. I live in Silver Spring. And my question is, given that the CEO of WMATA testified before Congress that essentially come, I think, the 2023 fiscal year, that unless they got more money or something changed, that they're going to be approaching a fiscal cliff and there would be cuts in services or other things. Just wondering, so thanks Delegate Korman for mentioning that you've talked about it. So question is, are there any sense of what potential solutions or proposals may be on deck? I rely on the Metro to go everywhere, that and Ride On. And I know a lot of people do, and it's, throughout Montgomery County. So if WMATA goes down, and certainly I'm not confident if Republicans take over, I'm certainly not confident they're going to be given more money. So, which means Maryland will have to, of course, do something. So I'm just curious to know if there are conversations people are having and what are some possible solutions.
Sure. Yeah, there's a couple of different funding cliffs, frankly, that WMATA is going to hit. One is on the capital side, and that's just because when we passed dedicated funding 5 years ago, it didn't grow. And Maryland tried to get ahead of that problem this year. It ran into a little bit of trouble towards the end of session, but I think we'll be able to fix that problem, at least on the Maryland side. On the operating side, though, yeah, I mean, it's really a revenue gap created by the huge drop in fares and the uncertainty of the time over which they will recover, and the expectation is they will not be fully recovered when the federal dollars run out. Now, I think we don't really know the gap. I mean, they have different numbers they've run and presented, but I don't think we fully know. I mean, I took the Metro to and from downtown today, and I was actually pleasantly surprised at how many people were on it. That's just anecdotal, obviously, but I think they don't fully know. It depends on if there's subsequent waves. I actually think this mask mandate, lifting it, which I don't think is a good idea for scientific reasons, is probably a good thing for ridership. I know that's kind of perverse to say, but I think that's just a reality of when do people feel comfortable? But I've heard different numbers batted around that they would be looking for Maryland, DC, and Virginia to basically each chip in an additional $75 million in operating subsidy a year for a couple of years while they try to sort of get a handle on where things are going to be. And Maryland already spends, I think it's close to $750 million a year on Metro a year. I think there's this idea that we don't contribute to Metro or don't contribute enough. We contribute quite a bit. And so that number is going to be a hard sell. I think we can get there. I think it'll help a lot if we have a Democratic governor to help lead us there. And of course, it's all going to be contingent on, Virginia stepping in also. We are not going to be able to, DC and Maryland are not going to pay Virginia's share. And so it's a big regional negotiation. I've probably already said more about than I'm probably supposed to. But over the years, the Council of Governments, COG, has done a good job of convening elected officials from around the area to try to make sure we're tackling some of these Metro issues. Unfortunately, we can't manage the Metro day to day, so that mess is still the way it is, but there have been discussions about how to potentially deal with this funding gap.
Thank you. The next question in the chat was one that's not necessarily directly related to housing, land use, and transit, but was asked. And so, Stu, do you want to go through your question?
Sure. Sort of a relatively simple measure, although it has more than complex possibly implications, is to say no new gas hookups for any new construction. And I know a version of that was in the Climate Solutions Now bill, and yet it got pulled out and never restored. It seems like such a simple, straightforward thing, especially because pipelines cost a lot of money. So if you say no new pipelines, you're saving the state a lot of money. So why is it so hard to get that through?
Delegate Stewart, just because you're on the.
Yeah, I was going to say, I guess this is mine. Yeah, so thanks, Sue, for that question. So I'm on the committee that, has done the negotiations around, some of the negotiations around the climate solutions bill the last couple of years. And I mean, I think the short answer to your question about why the new construction all electrification requirement was taken out is honestly just the power of the utility companies and some of their allies. I mean, that's the sort of like shortest answer, is that the entire bill was a negotiation between sort of grassroots activists and environmental leaders on the one hand, and the power of a lot of different corporations who have a financial interest in the status quo. And obviously, anytime you craft a bill like this, it's a delicate balance of push and pull of trying to see what all parties can live with and agree with. And I think that was left on the cutting room floor simply because the argument from, there was a lot of argument from, variety of corporate actors that it was going to put too much pressure on the grid and a lot of stuff that I don't think has a whole lot of scientific basis, but that's just the reality of the legislative process. And I think the only way you can overcome, organized money is with organized people. And so I think that's absolutely a step that Maryland will take. It's a matter of when and not if we update standards around new construction if we're going to ever be serious about the climate crisis. And so I'm hopeful that with a new slate of legislatures, with more organizing, we can ultimately overcome, I think the handful of repeat players in Annapolis that wield outsized influence.
The legislators feel the time pressure that, if you look at the IPCC reports, we're running out of time. We probably have run out of time. For catastrophic climate change, it's going to affect everybody's lives for the negative. Do legislators not realize this? I mean, it's like they haven't changed their priorities, is how it feels like. They haven't really weighed what's going to hit us.
Listen, I agree with you 100%. I feel that frustration very viscerally every day during the legislative session when these arguments were happening. So I very much feel you. And I guess I don't know if it's rhetorical, but the short answer is that I would say that legislators feel that urgency to varying degrees.
Thank you.
I mean, the only thing I would add, Sue, because I think Vaughn is 100% correct. I think we forget sometimes how important it is to have a Democratic governor. I think we've been stuck obviously with Hogan, but it just changes the dynamic so much in the General Assembly. If you have a governor who is leading on these and is putting pressure on the General Assembly to meet bigger goals, it's very different than the General Assembly essentially having to fight the governor. And then obviously it means, while Governor Hogan ultimately didn't veto climate solutions, he threatened it. And so that meant every piece of policy that went into that bill was being looked at through the lens of how do we get enough votes to make sure that we can override his veto. And while, we have a fair bit more room to spare in the House, it's not necessarily the same thing in the Senate. And so having somebody in the governor's mansion who is pushing the General Assembly, some of our colleagues who are not as forward thinking on this stuff, versus somebody who, is just threatening to block everything just makes a big difference.
Thank you. And I think we have time for one last question, which will be from Mike Larkin. Mike, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, Jane. Thank you, Jane. Wasn't expecting. Yeah, so I was very excited to hear about this continual funding for BRT, this 27 million per year that has standards connected to it, which is really exciting. I was just wondering how likely is MoCo going to get it? I know that the operating budget talked about dedicated lanes on the northern route 355 and so forth, but from what I understand, it's still not necessarily a done, plan, but we'll see what happens as we go along. And considering what happened on US 29, I'm just concerned, is it likely that we're going to see a lot of that money? And what is the feeling from the county that they're going to really try to meet these standards?
We qualify for the money. Right now, we're the only county that qualifies for the money. That could change in the future. Howard or Charles could qualify in the future. The money does not have to be used on a line of BRT that meets the standards in the bill, but to qualify to get the money as a county, you have to have a stretch that meets the standards in the bill. And so we have that with the flash. Obviously, we want to push them to do true BRT everywhere, but the way it was crafted is so that Montgomery County would qualify.
What's the length of the stretch? I know I could probably go look it up myself in the bill.
Yeah, it's not spelled out, but I can. My email's in the chat, so I'm happy to send you the bill and we can talk through some of the issues. But it was specifically written to make sure that Montgomery County would benefit from this money.
Thank you.
Is it 27 million per year or? Yeah.
So once the Stadium Authority, starts drawing lottery revenue to service bonds and Canada and M&T, which could be in 2 years. It might not start the next budget year. Then counties that are eligible, which just will only be Montgomery County, will get 27 million a year.
Gotcha.
When other counties come online, if they don't already have a Stadium Authority stadium, if they don't already have Camden Yards or M&T Bank, they will also be able to qualify from the same pool. And so then it'll be done on sort of a per capita basis, but in the short term, we'll be the sole beneficiaries.
Great, thank you for that clarification. And I know that we're 2 minutes to 8 and that Delegate Korman needs to head out at 8, but there is one more question in the chat. If anybody needs to head out at 8, somebody just put another one, and I'm sorry, I don't think we'll be able to get to it, Joel. But if we're able to quickly answer Anashal's question, would you like to take yourself off mute and ask your question? Anashal Miller. If not, I can read it. Okay, I can read it. I'm not familiar with this bill, but SB 14 HB 100, this bill establishes $750,000 to promote the environmental, economic, and social sustainability of Maryland communities, pass how we exist within the planning as impacted persons.
I can actually quickly answer that. So that was a bill that I introduced with Senator Elfreth from Annapolis. So it funds a program called Sustainable Maryland that's operated out of the University of Maryland. Basically, what Sustainable Maryland does is it created this sort of sustainable communities, green community program. And then within that, it helps, once the community is certified as green, it helps provide, sort of planning and, technical assistance for municipalities and cities and towns across the state to do some more of the sort of technical, sustainable goal, climate change, environmental work that, oftentimes individual municipalities don't have the capacity themselves to do. And we know we won't hit our climate goals. This is something Senator Elfreth said, ad nauseum. We will not hit our climate goal. She's the one of the co-chairs of the Chesapeake Bay Commission. Unless our municipalities are able to step up and do this. And so Sustainable Maryland has been operating pretty much based off of federal grants. They've gotten money from the EPA that has declined, or private philanthropic efforts, and it's not a guaranteed source of funding. And so we put the bill in at $750,000. We ultimately got $500,000, which is pretty pretty happy with, of dedicated sustainable funding every year that they know they can count on, which will allow them to expand their programming. We hope to even beyond municipalities to HOAs and community associations, and be able to actually start giving out micro grants as well. So really excited that we got that bill through. Took a couple of years, kind of ran into a little bit of the COVID buzzsaw, but really happy to get that through this year. So thanks for the question.
Great, thank you for your answer. And thank you for being here this evening to Delegate Solomon and Delegate Stewart. I saw that Delegate Korman had to hop off, but really appreciate your leadership on all of these issues and your time tonight and all of your time spent in Annapolis. Really appreciate it. And really appreciate everyone who was here tonight and participated in this conversation and asked really great questions. This conversation was recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel, as all of our virtual meetings are. I meant to say earlier when Delegate Stewart mentioned Zachary Marks and social housing, that our last virtual meeting back in February was all about social housing in Montgomery County. And that was a really excellent conversation with Zach and with James Hedrick. And you can find that on our YouTube channel as well. So thank you, everybody. I hope to see you all at our picnic in May, and then virtually again in June. So take care, stay safe, and have a great rest of your week. Good night. Oh, yes, library action. Carrie, I totally forgot to share that. We will be meeting on Sunday at 2 p.m. at the Chevy Chase Library to rally for affordable housing, to redevelop the library with housing on top. The library is badly in need of repairs. I'm so sorry for forgetting that, Carrie, so thank you for reminding me. And I know that a lot of you have registered to attend, but we need you to bring as many people along, your significant others, your friends, your family, your neighbors, your roommates, anyone who you can bring. 2 p.m. Chevy Chase Library. We will be there. This is an event co-sponsored with Action in Montgomery, Montgomery for All, and Coalition for Smarter Growth. And so there is information. Let me make sure I put the registration link in the chat before you all go. Oh.
I'll try to bring someone, Jane, but I'm the second most hated man in the county after Mike English.
There's something about that Mike name, I guess.
And you're third, right?
Oh, yeah. Nice to have two people in front of me, though. All right. Well, thank you all very much for being here, and I hope to see you all on Sunday. Take care. And yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome, Mike English. Mike, you're just the most famous out of all of us because of your incredible Twitter presence. So it's the crown is heavy as the head that wears the crown. Is that the phrase? I would say heavy is the person who wears the blue check mark, but none of us have quite achieved that yet. Mike can't defend himself because I turned off being able to unmute. All right, take care, everybody. Have a good rest of your week and a great weekend. Bye.